Welcome back, Biology. Today we're going to start talking about Chapter 19, which is also in Ecology, but it is specifically looking at a chunk of ecology, just the population size of ecology. So we're not talking about ecosystems or niches today. We're talking about populations and population ecology. So the first thing we need to talk about is what is a population and kind of define that a little bit more clearly. A population is a group of organisms that belong to the same species, so like all of these owls are the same species here, that live in a particular place at the same time. So the size of that population is how many individuals are going to be in there. It's a really important property. It's something that we care about for endangered status of animals and is the population growing or shrinking. But it can be hard to measure population size. If it's made of small and immobile organisms like plants, it's really easy to count. Go out into a field and count how many sunflowers are there. They're pretty easy to distinguish. They don't move around, so that you can kind of count them pretty easily. If it is something that is an abundant population, a widespread population over a long area, or very mobile, it's harder to count exactly individual organisms, so you can use estimates instead. These owls here, they're flying around. They're mostly active during night when we're not very good at seeing. So counting these guys is going to be a lot more difficult than counting something like plants or trees or even slower moving creatures. When we talk about population, we can use something called density. And population density measures how crowded a population is. So it's how many individuals are in a certain area or a certain volume. When we talk about bacteria, we'll talk about how many bacteria per milliliter. But when we talk about bigger things like squirrels, we'll talk about number of squirrels per acres, or squirrels per mile, or wolves per mile, or this map here is telling people per area, per square kilometer. So the more dark red that you get, kind of in like these India and some of these African countries here, you have a lot of people that live very, very close together. Where in places like Canada here and Russia and the bottom parts of South America, you have very little people kind of squished together. We could talk about dispersion for populations, and this is the spatial distribution. How do they accumulate inside of space? We can have clumped ones here, where these groups are in a group, they're clustered together. This kind of, it can be a lot of things that cause this. It can be that that's where the resources are. That's where they have a territory. That's, their herd kind of moves together. Whatever reason that may be. They can have a random one where there's an unpredictable dispersion. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. This is usually happens in species that don't interact very frequently with each other, that they aren't very social. And we have uniform, and this is where organisms are spaced in this kind of even distribution throughout this. This is a good example of this would be like coyotes or wolves, where they're all fighting for the same resource, so they're very territorial, and these territories have certain boundaries and sizes, and they don't really interact with each other outside of that. Population dynamics, this is a kind of a branch of ecology where we're looking at how populations change over time. So all populations are constantly changing. They are growing, shrinking. Um, they are changing constantly. Even if they stay the same, their alleles are changing. They're getting new genes. So to get good data on this, we need to know more about their size, their density, and their dispersion. Some stats that we'll look at are things like birth rate, which is the number of births occurring in a period of time, usually yearly. We'll look at death rate, the number of deaths in a period of time. And then we'll look at life expectancy, or how long an individual is expected to live. And in 2017, human life expectancy was 78.6 years. We can kind of see here that there is a kind of correlation between how fast your heart beats and how long you live. Humans are kind of the one outsider on here, but all of these slower heartbeat animals lion, whale, elephant, horse, and even humans to some extent, around 60, usually live longer for our mammals. So, kind of cool there. Also, usually the bigger you are, the slower your heartbeat. But once again, humans are kind of that outlier there. When we talk about populations, we can talk about age structure. And this is the distribution of individuals among different ages. How many people are 20? How many people are 10? How many people are 60? Is what this kind of measure gives us. The reason we care about this, as individuals age, they behave differently, they reproduce differently, they have different eating patterns, they can have morphological changes, they could be butterflies versus caterpillars, there can be a lot of differences between youngsters and the older population. This is showing the age dispersal of the United States population. As you can see, as you get up closer to 100 after, looks like 55 here, 50, these numbers are getting smaller. There's less and less individuals, both male and female, living to 100. So when we look at populations, another thing we look at is the patterns of mortality. And mortality of species depends on a lot of things in their lifetime, but most types of organisms end up being one of three types of survivorship curve. And these survivorship curves are showing the probability that members will survive to a certain age. So it's over time, what percentage of them are still remaining and still surviving. So in type 1, which is like humans here, it's this dashed line here, not the dotted one, the dashed line. The likelihood of dying is really small. Most of these, there's usually 100% of organisms surviving past infancy there. And then as they get older, they start to slowly die off. This is the type 1 curve where it starts out strong and then falls off at the end. Type 2 is the likelihood of death is equal throughout their life. So songbirds are a great example of this. They have equal chance to die in the nest as a youngster than they do living to old age and dying of natural causes. And then type 3, they're likely to die young, and then the ones that do survive usually survive all the way to life expectancy. So this is like frogs. You start out with hundreds and hundreds of little eggs in a pond, and as they all hatch and are trying to fight for resources, many get eaten and many don't make it to that adult frog form. So lots dying off here, and then they start to die off much slower later in life. So our next topic here is measuring populations. Populations are growing and changing over time. The growth rate is the amount by which a population's size changes in a given time. So it can grow, it can shrink, or it can remain the same. And it's based on a couple things. It's based on how many births are happening, how many deaths are happening, and then immigration and emigration. Immigration is this movement of individuals into a population, meaning the population will grow in size. Emigration is the movement of individuals out of a population, meaning the population will shrink. In large populations or populations that have a considerable size, we will divide the population into groups. Usually we'll say every 1,000 individuals, we'll mean one individual per 1,000. However we want to kind of figure out what a good number is for that group. Are we talking about 1 million bacteria? Or are we talking about 6 cheetahs? So we can find the growth rate by taking the birth rate, subtracting the death rate, and that will give us the growth rate. If it's positive, that means that this population is growing. It's getting bigger. If it's negative, this means this population is shrinking. And then if it's 0, if it's right in the middle, if there's equal amount of births and deaths, there is 0 growth rate. There's not no growth rate, there's just 0 growth rate. That population is staying stable. A type of growth that can happen inside of populations is this exponential kind of growth. And so this happens anytime that we have more births than death, we get growth of populations. If these populations are each generation now is having more individuals and they're all able to breed successfully, this population starts to grow very quickly. We call this exponential growth, and it makes this very characteristic J shape here. Exponential growth usually only happens for a short amount of time, because each individual has to have enough resources to grow to maturity and then breed and then have offspring of their own. So there's not a lot of organisms getting eaten during this time. There's not a lot of organisms dying during this time. It is just they're taking off and they're growing as fast as they can. This would be like rabbits before the wolf population or the lynx population got bigger. With exponential growth, usually what happens and stops this process is a limiting factor. And this is a factor or a pressure that restrains the growth of a population. It takes this population and it slows down the growth. And it prevents these guys from growing indefinitely and just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So in this example here, the limiting factor is space. These 3 fish have plenty of space to live and breed and reproduce. These 100 or so fish, 50 or so fish, don't have that. They are past their limiting factor for space. They're no longer able to swim around in here. So we can get exponential growth, but it usually only happens for a short amount of time. It's not something that usually happens and continues over and over and over and over again forever. Usually as populations grow, they are having more competition for limited resources that decreases survivability and kind of caps them at a certain number. The next type of growth is the logistic model. So this starts out exponential, so we slow growth, but then we have this exponential growth here. But what this does have that a exponential model doesn't, it has a carrying capacity, this K. This is the number that the individuals the environment can support long term. So this will start to grow really, really fast. They will slow down as they reach that carrying capacity, and then they will eventually get to that zero population growth where they're not either growing or declining. So it'll go until it gets to the carrying capacity, and then it will become stable. All right, so there are some things that regulate population size. There's 2 kinds of these limiting factors. The first is density independent factors, and they reduce the population by the same amount regardless of population size. So when we take and we do this fire here, if you're a plant species, doesn't matter how many of you there are, this fire is going to burn equally. It's going to burn all of this area, and all those plant species are going to be equally affected. In these weather here, it doesn't matter how many trees there are, a certain amount of them are going to get blown down by these heavy winds. So things like this are usually nature kind of happening here. So things like weather, things like floods, things like fires are these more independent style, density independent factors. The other type is the density dependent factors. And these are things that are triggered by increased population density or dependent on the density of a population. So things that limit populations due to their density are going to be things like shortages of food, shortages of nesting sites, and all of these other kind of things that as we get more competition, they're not able to survive as well. So these osprey here, only 2 of them can use this nest. So these other 2 are kind of currently without a nest. They're in this spot where they need to find a nest to be able to reproduce, or they're not going to be able to. So in density dependent factors, your individual chance of surviving depends on the number of individuals in the area and the resources that are available for that. With these different kind of factors and stuff, we have population fluctuations. So some of these are linked to genetics, some of these are linked to environmental changes. So in the case of like having a drought, we can get reduced deer population, or this is what's happening here. These fish are overheating because of a drought. This water is no longer deep enough for them, so they are unable to get the oxygen that they are needed to survive, and many of them will pass away because they are not able to survive in this kind of environment. Some population fluctuations and trends are not so evident. They're not like, oh, there's a fire, there's a drought, there's a flood. The guy who kind of is looking at this interdependence and looking at these trends was named Charles S. Elton. He kind of took notice in the small changes in populations. So Elton was taking records of snowshoe hare pelts uh, and that were collected by the Hudson Bay Company of Canada during the fur trapping, and he was kind of saying, hey, this is some good data for how many snowshoe hares are out there. So he kind of guessed that the number of pelts purchased a year was kind of indicative of the size of that population. And what the records show is that every 10 years there was a spike in these snowshoe hare populations. And then he also took a look at some other animals, including the lynx, which is a predator of the hare, and he discovered that the lynx had kind of the same thing going on, these spikes and these falls, these high rises and these falls. And Elton asked the question, what caused this cyclic occurrence? What caused these snowshoe hares and lynxes to rise and fall back and forth here? And what he kind of thought was that the population's growth or decline affected the other ones. So as we got more and more rabbits, which is the green one on this graph, we got more and more lynxes, the orange one on this graph, kind of lagging behind them because now they had more food to eat. As the lynx number grew, right after the lynxes reach their peak, the rabbits will decline here. And this is because now they're getting eaten more, so they don't have the ability to reproduce as fast. They have a higher death rate than they have a birth rate, so their population would fall. Once there's no rabbits, now the lynxes don't have food, so their population would then decline and then start the whole cycle over again. You'd have rabbits would now not have any predators, they'd take off, get a lot of reproduction going on, and then they'd start to die off again as the more and more lynxes started to breed. And this kind of happens every 10 years, over and over and over again. It's a really good example of these small things in ecology and population science that aren't usually like super obvious from year to year. So with populations, it is bad to be a small population. So as we grow and as we spread across the country, we have created some stresses on some native populations of animals, plants, fungus, any kind of organism there. An example is there's only 200 Siberian tigers in the wild because of hunting and habitat destruction. So what we've taken is similarly things happened to the California condor, where we only had 9 individuals at a certain one point in time. We talked about bottlenecking before, but it took all of these genes in the original population, and after the bottleneck, where only this green and this brown gene survived, now we only have 2 genetics inside of this population. So we have simplified the population because we got rid of all of these different organisms, all of these different individuals of a population that were adding genetic variation to it. So the smaller your population, the more vulnerable they are to extinction, the more vulnerable they are to these processes. So some more perils to small populations include environmental disturbances like storms, floods, fires, disease. All of these things have the potential to kill many or all of an entire population. As we get smaller and smaller amounts of organisms, the likelihood of inbreeding is more common. And so this is when relatives are breeding with each other, and this leads to decreased genetic variability. And in some way, this is kind of what we do when we are breeding purebloods of dogs. We're taking all the genetics of dogs, we're getting rid of most of them, and then we have whatever makes the purebred, and then we're just continuing to breed those genes over and over again. And this gets us decreased genetic variability and increase of those recessive traits like bad hips and leukemia and all these other kind of genetic downfalls there and pitfalls. The last thing we're going to talk about are human population growth. As a species, Homo sapiens are one of our best guesses is around 500,000 years ago. We started to grace the earth with our presence. And until around 10 to 12,000 years ago, our population grew very slowly. We stayed at more of a kind of constant growth model there. But during the time before 10 to 12,000 years ago, we lived in small nomadic groups. We obtained food by hunting animals, gathering roots and berries and nuts and shellfish and fruit, anything that we could get from nature. This way of life we called the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And there are some hunter-gatherers still alive today, and by looking at their societies and their kind of lifestyle, we can see that their lifestyle was hard. They had high mortality rates. Infants and young children weren't expected to live very long. It was a pretty hard life. In that time period, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, our hunter lifestyle changed, and we became an agrarian society here. We began to domesticate animals and cultivate certain types of plants for food. And this was what we called the agricultural revolution right here. And this stabilized our supply of food. So it allows our population, as you can see here, we started to grow much more quickly between this 8000 BC here and 1850 AD. Being able to have more food meant that you could spend more time on medicine, means you didn't have to travel, you didn't have to migrate. All of these things were beneficial to the human race, and they started to grow more quickly. We then come into the population explosion here, where through the Middle Ages, we are continuing to grow. We have some short-term, like every a couple years, we have some negative growth. In 1357, which is still up here, we had the bubonic plague come through, and it killed about 25% of the European population. So it was a massive blow to the population of those areas. After 1650, which is right around here on this map, we started to grow really fast due to decelerated death rates. We had lots less deaths because we had more modern medicine. We figured out more about how to treat human illness. By 1800, we were at our first billion here, right around here. And it took a long time. It took 10,000 years almost for us to get to 1 billion. It took us 130 years to get the next billion. And then we went from 3 billion to 5 billion in just 27 years. So human growth has gotten exponential starting right around here in this year 0. And this is kind of what exponential growth looks like. It's this J here. This one's a little more stretched out because it took us a long time from 10,000 to 0 here to figure out how to grow food and have the industrialization to have a big population. We still have human population growth today. It's slowing down. We had the most human growth rate in 1960. We are still growing, however, at a rate that's unsustainable. We're growing too fast for the resources we have on the planet. With more people, we have more babies. Even though our growth rate is lower, we're still on the planet, still growing. So we have this kind of image here shows where the population is. Most of the population's in China and India. All these red ones are Asian countries. The green ones are North American and South American countries. And the blue ones are European countries. And then the brown ones are African countries. 20% of our world lives in what we call developed countries, or those ones are modernized and have that industrialized kind of center. And we have economics, and we have healthcare, and we have all those things. So we would include in there United States, France, Germany, Canada, Russia. On average, the people who live here are healthier, live longer, have better education, and we tend to have a lower growth rate. We're not having as many kids. We're not having, 6 to 7 kids anymore. We're having 1 or 2, maybe 3. In our developing countries, or those that are working up to get to that developed kind of status there, is about 80% of the world living in these countries. So there's lots of Asian, it's anything that's red on this map. So anything, lots of Asian, lots of African countries, Central America, South America. In general, these countries are poorer. Their populations are growing faster. They're having more kids. They're having 3 or 4 or 5 kids. Pretty much every family is. So they have a faster growth rate than our kind of more developed countries. As countries grow and as the population grows, we get a demographic transition. So we start out really, really low here, and then we have this kind of exponential growth, and then we figure out, hey, this is the comfortable level here, so we stop and we slow down here, and then there's actually a time in a country's kind of development when we stop growing and we start declining as we start to have less and less kids and more people start to die off in a country. So this demographic transition is showing these changes. As we like I said, this growth is caused by economic and social standards that kind of allow the population to explode. We get less deaths as we have better hygiene, better nutrition, and better education. And then eventually these equal out and we have birth rates not having as many births. Our older population starts to die, and then we have this kind of flat spot. And then eventually this population starts to decline. And we see this in countries like Germany and a lot of your other European countries that have already reached their maximum and are now starting to decline again. This concludes chapter 19. I hope this kind of gave you some insight into some population science and some population ecology. If you have any questions, let me know, and have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you in the next one.